Josh, thank you so much for being here. Sleep is something over the years I've kind of realized has been, in your words, the ultimate force multiplier. So, super excited to dive into all things sleep today.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I was reading this article before we started today about TikTok causing digital dementia, was
Yeah.
the way that they phrased it. And it was terrifying, and it didn't even mention the effects on sleep.
Yeah.
What do you think the effects of TikTok are on sleep, particularly before bed?
Yeah. So it's really interesting that you bring this up. I actually just interacted this morning with my niece. She's 10 and she had her iPad out and she was on TikTok showing me videos. A couple things really struck me when she was doing this. The speed at which kids are consuming content and interacting with apps is unbelievable. I thought that my thumbs moved pretty quickly, but watching her move around the iPad was insane. You know, you're switching contexts every 3 or 4 seconds, and that does a lot of things to your brain and to your ability to attenuate and have a conversation and hold a single line of thought for a significant amount of time. So outside of its impacts on sleep, um, we're seeing the diagnoses of ADD and attention related disorders is skyrocketing, and I think one of the culprits here is not necessarily that there's suddenly some genetic problem that's coming up in our kids and the youth, but it's actually the content that they're consuming and the amount that they are consuming, right? So I think our ability to attenuate to things as a society has decreased significantly. So as it relates to sleep, a lot of people are very familiar with how how the interaction between blue light and sleep. We can dig into that if you're curious, but the real the real danger in utilizing your phone at night is actually found in the novel experiences that the phone is able to give you. So what I mean by that is when we think about sleep, we want to be, it's often described as like landing a plane. You're flying at 30,000 feet for most of the day, doing a bunch of things and your daily tasks and all of that. And when you go down to sleep, you want to land that plane. But what's like one of the most alerting activities you can do? That is going and getting your constant dopamine hits from social media. And so um, basically what we see is, we'll have people that come to us with years of insomnia, and one of the first things that we notice is that they're using their phone in bed at night right before they go to bed. They use it as sort of a digital pacifier, to kind of um, quell the anxieties of the day and all of that, and kind of turn their brains off, as they put it. The reality is it's doing the opposite of that. It's sending alerting signals. It's forming psychological associations between your bed and this idea of being alert and engaged in this content. And that's actually the real problem with phone and screen usage, is creating that psychological association. So yeah, happy to drill down into any piece of that if you'd like, but um, that's one of the main issues behind TikTok at night is
Yeah,
those alerting signals. Yeah.
it's crazy, and I there's a lot there that I want to dive
Sure.
into. You mentioned digital pacifier, which I think is a great term, very interesting. But I want to start with insomnia because it's something
Sure.
that I made an observation the other day, and I would be curious your thoughts on this. That it seems to be a very major connection between people who have mental health issues and poor sleep patterns or
Yeah,
insomnia. And I don't know if that's documented in the literature,
it is.
but it seems to be something that I've just noticed in certain people I've interacted with. And so, for someone who either has insomnia, diagnosed or not, what do you think people should be doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, let me just say you asked about this being documented in the literature. There is not a single psychiatric condition on earth that does not have an impact, and a very significant one, on your sleep and sleep architecture. So that's just the first thing to say.
Wow.
Every single psychiatric diagnosis you've heard of impacts your sleep. So with insomnia in particular, there are three different types of insomnia that are worth talking about, and you can address all of them in similar ways. But it's important to know, like, if you're experiencing symptoms, what they might look like. So, the first is sleep onset insomnia. This is when you have difficulty falling asleep. So these are the people that are laying in bed. Maybe you have some ruminating thoughts or anxiety at night, and you're laying there for 2-3 hours before you're able to finally fall asleep. Interestingly, a very common emergent behavior in people who have sleep onset insomnia is phone use, because you're kind of just laying there. What else are you going to do other than, maybe I'll coin this term, but that digital pacifier thing that you were kind of latching onto earlier.
It's a great term.
Yeah, but it forms this like really terrible cycle where maybe you initially had a sleep issue and you're trying to remedy it with the phone, but then the phone ends up being the reason that you have the sleep issue later on. Okay, so that's one type of insomnia. The other is called sleep maintenance insomnia. So the common way that this presents is, maybe you're able to go to sleep just fine, but you'll wake up a couple hours later, and then you won't be able to go back to sleep. And you finally will go back to sleep, but you'll wake up again. In general, for most people, it's normal to wake up at night. One, maybe even 2 times, 3 times. But you should be able to go back to sleep pretty quickly. If you're spending more than 20 minutes in bed after one of these wake ups and you're not able to go back to sleep, you may start to think about talking to a healthcare provider about this specific sleep maintenance insomnia. The other type of insomnia is where you're waking up a couple hours before you want to. So let's say that you have your alarm set for 7, and every day you're waking up at 5, and then you're just laying there and you're not able to go back to sleep. So those are kind of the three different types of insomnia that you'll see. So there's plenty of literature that connects a lot of these different types of insomnia to different psychiatric diagnoses, like we were alluding to earlier. So the sleep onset insomnia and the sleep maintenance insomnia, very common that you see this. We call it a comorbid with an anxiety disorder or an anxiety issue. These can be acute, by the way. So if you have some, for example, if you have like a huge test or like a performance, athletic or otherwise, that you're kind of looking forward to the next day, it's actually common that you'll start to exhibit symptoms of this sleep onset or sleep maintenance insomnia as a result of that. Depression ends up looking a little different. Depression looks, for most people, will end up looking like that third option that I mentioned, where you're waking up a couple hours before you would otherwise like to. So, yeah, it's really interesting, kind of exploring that connection of different psychiatric illnesses and sleep. I actually anticipate in the future, when you think about how psychiatric illness is diagnosed today, you're going in, you're having a conversation with a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and there's a lot of subjective reasoning that's happening in that conversation where you ultimately land on a diagnosis. I actually expect in the future that analyzing sleep is going to be a mechanism for objectively diagnosing some of these conditions, and then further modulating the treatment and titrating down, drugs or cognitive behavioral therapies or things like this. So it's kind of an interesting field to dig into more.
I hope it goes in that direction for sure, because do you see it as like a chicken or an egg story where you don't really know which came first? Or is that pretty well understood in terms of it's the anxiety impacting the sleep or the sleep impacting the anxiety? What is that relationship there? Do we know?
Yeah, it's a bidirectional one. Often, when you think about things relating to sleep, this ends up being the case. So, just to use another completely different example, like pain. A lot of people, if you have some sort of like rheumatoid arthritis or some sort of like chronic source of pain, you see this interfering with people's sleep. But what we know about sleep deprivation is it lowers our pain tolerance, and it actually makes pain feel more intense the next day, if you haven't had adequate sleep. And so you see again this bidirectional relationship. So the less you sleep, the more pain you're in, but the more pain you're in, the less you're able to sleep. It's very similar with something like an anxiety disorder. We do know that often when a psychiatrist or a psychologist is addressing something like anxiety or depression, sleep should be like at the top of the list of interventions or at least mechanisms that we're using to try and address the condition, right? So we do know that if you are chronically underslept, your propensity to be depressed or to experience anxiety is elevated significantly. And we know that if you were to improve the sleep in a patient with depression or with anxiety, there is improvement there. Another interesting facet of this is sometimes psychologists will use sleep deprivation to treat depression, which is um, a really interesting kind of approach to this as well. So,
How does that work? Sorry to cut you off.
yeah, no, you're totally fine. So, just to be clear, I am not either of those things. I'm not a
Yeah.
psychologist or a psychiatrist, but yeah, there's been some really interesting data coming out recently around this concept of using sleep deprivation to treat depression. One of the I'm not exactly sure what the mechanisms are there, but kind of something that's analogous to this is the way that we think about treating insomnia actually involves sleep deprivation. So we're going to actually restrict someone's sleep over the course of weeks in order to get them, to stop waking up every night at the rate that they were before. So we're targeting something called sleep efficiency, which is the total amount of time you spend asleep versus the total of time you were in bed. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about, you know, when we want to pull back on the amount of sleep you're getting versus when we want you to get the full night.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier the relationship between things like rheumatoid
Yeah.
arthritis and other chronic conditions.
Mhm.
Almost everything has this. We mentioned it at the beginning of the podcast. It's the force multiplier. Like, I've experienced some skin issues, and that's how I learned of the power of sleep, is that through that I saw that if my diet was bad and I slept like shit, then I would get a flare up. If my diet was bad and I was sleeping great, I wouldn't get a flare up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple things to respond to there with your diet in particular. One of the things that we know about sleep deprivation, your propensity to eat junk food and to eat like, that bag of potato chips and potentially finish it is directly correlated with the amount of sleep you got the night before. We have trouble as a species controlling our appetite when we're sleep deprived. That's a very well documented
Mhm.
phenomenon that happens. Um, so that's the first thing. The second thing is just to kind of echo what you're saying about the power of sleep. We know that a night of sleep deprivation will actually cause low grade inflammation the next day, which makes a ton of sense considering what you just said about your skin condition. Often, with a variety of different skin conditions like psoriasis and others, um, all you need is a stress response in your body or that low grade inflammation to trigger one of these outbreaks. And so, yeah, it's a very well understood phenomenon, and it's something that, just to echo what you're saying, I mean, there's sleep is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important to get enough quality sleep as well.
I have a friend who is trying to lose some weight,
Yeah,
and he I've been helping him out with that, with some diet stuff, but he has sleep apnea.
yeah,
And based on what we're saying, it seems like that would be the first thing to address in order to make sure that the weight loss is sustained over time. So for people with sleep apnea, what can they do? What do you think the best path forward is?
definitely. Yeah, again, just to underscore something that you're saying, as far as something that we do at Absolute Rest, for example, is we work a lot with blood work, which is not commonly done in the sleep industry. And so, one of the reasons for that is we use it to understand the magnitude of the issue that we observe. So, let's say that we see sleep apnea in one of our clients. We'll actually go look at their blood to see, what are your fasted glucose levels? What are your lipid profiles look like? What does your testosterone look like? There are so many different facets of human health that are directly correlated to your ability to sleep at an adequate duration, at an adequate quality. So sleep apnea is something that actually affects roughly, and we're not exactly sure what the number is, but 5 to 8% of the population of the world. Um, that is a very high and significant number, considering how detrimental it is to your health. So, one of the insidious parts of sleep apnea is it's often really hard to diagnose. Unless you're getting a specific apnea test, you wouldn't really have any indication, without like doing a lot of reading and understanding like some of the different symptoms that come up. So, I actually recommend specifically, I know a lot of your listeners are men over the age of 25, even if you don't snore, even if you haven't had a partner complain, or you don't wake up throughout the night, I would just get tested. There's no reason not to, considering the high prevalence of this, specifically in men over 25. So yeah. Okay. So how do you address sleep apnea once it is discovered? Right. The way to discover this, by the way, there are so many like at home tests that you can do. It's
Mhm.
actually a really like, despite the fact that no one does these tests, it's actually really simple to get a apnea diagnosis. Um, I don't have any relationship with companies like this, but like companies like Lofta, they have like a quick $200 assessment you can do with a device called the WatchPat One, which is used by like dozens of companies for this purpose. Okay, so here's how the first line treatment for sleep apnea in general, if you were to kind of interface with the medical system to do this, is something called a CPAP machine. It's a continuous positive airway pressure. You may have heard of this. Basically, what it's doing is it's keeping constant pressure throughout your entire airway, and preventing you from going into these apneic states, which is where you stop breathing throughout the night. So that's the first line treatment. There are several other ways to address something like sleep apnea. First of all, one of the things that we see, it's very common in overweight individuals or people who have a lot of mass around their neck, be it from, we work with a lot of like NFL linemen, for example, that
Mm.
they're not necessarily overweight, but they just have so much muscle around their neck
Yeah.
that when they're laying down at night, it's literally pressing down on their airway. So you know, if you're like a young fit individual and you're diagnosed with sleep apnea, oftentimes it's because of the musculature in your tongue. It's really interesting. So you've got a basically there's a muscle responsible for protruding your tongue out of your mouth, specifically when you're in something called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. Your body goes into what's called atonia, which is where your muscles lose tone during the night, right? What happens to that specific muscle in your tongue is it actually falls back to
Mm.
the back of your throat. Um, there are certain exercises and basically what that does is it ends up blocking your airway, and causes these apneic events. It's something called obstructive sleep apnea, right? So one of the things that you can do is actually myofunctional exercises, which is where you're specifically training that one muscle in your tongue, and this is something we do with a lot of our customers as well. Other things that you might consider are positional therapy, right? So you may have heard, I'm not sure, maybe you are a snorer, for example, but you may have heard people say like, I only snore when I'm on my back.
Mm.
So this is a very common thing because of what I just said. So basically, your tongue will again fall back, and that causes snoring and other apneic events. So a lot of times what we see in the data of our customers is, maybe they breathe really well on their left side, so we try and keep them on the left side. So sometimes we'll give them like little devices that they wear, like inflatable backpacks that they can wear at night, in order to stay there. Yeah, so those are a couple like ways to address it. One of the things to mention is that CPAP is not a totally benign therapy, like is commonly discussed. What ends up happening in CPAP therapy is that the musculature of your respiratory system actually, in some cases, weakens because of this kind of external force that's going into it, because you're not relying on your own muscles basically to perform the breath. Um, and so what ends up happening is people who get on CPAP for a long period of time, they actually end up like dependent on it their entire life. despite other therapies, because they literally just don't have
Mm.
the proper musculature in their airway. So there are a bunch of exercises that you can do that kind of focus on strengthening that as well. So that's something to look into for those that are on CPAP therapy.
And when it comes to diagnosing it,
Yeah.
do you think that things like the Aura Ring and like a Whoop will give you a good idea if you see like, okay, I'm waking up 15 times during the night, I most likely have sleep apnea. Are those pretty good indicators of sleep apnea?
No, so I think those are signals.
Mhm.
Here's some things to look out for, right? So again, when you look at Whoop data, when you look at Aura data, you're going to see something like 10 to 20 wake ups a night, and that's not something we're generally concerned about. That's just the natural sleep cycles that you're going through. Where we do get concerned is if we're getting up and doing and we're noticing symptoms. So, as an example, a lot of people with undiagnosed sleep apnea will wake up multiple times throughout the night with the need to urinate, right? So, really quick kind of physiology note: when you wake up, basically when you go to sleep, a couple things are happening. So your brain is producing something, a hormone called vasopressin. It does a bunch of things in your body, but one of the things that it does is it suppresses your kidney function. So this makes a lot of sense. We don't want to be excreting fluid throughout the night, right? So basically, that is shut down. Um, Also, when we wake up um, and we have these feelings of uh, basically, sleep apnea can often be like, for your body, is basically the same thing as drowning.
Mm.
So you're just sucking for air, and nothing's there to breathe, right? When we have that sensation, our heart actually produces a peptide called ANP. And basically, ANP again does a bunch of different things in your body, but one of the things that it does is it sends signals everywhere saying we need to excrete fluid from our body, right? So that's why when you wake up with sleep apnea, you may be sweating. You may have that need to urinate because your kidneys have kicked back on because now you're awake and you're no longer producing vasopressin and you have that peptide present. And your heart rate will be elevated. So if you're waking up feeling any of those three things, that's an interesting indicator and something that we'd want to look at. Another thing to pay attention to is snoring. A lot of, again, this is something that a lot of people talk about as a benign thing. Snoring in and of itself is not benign, especially over decades. It can actually cause cholesterol to be stored in the vasculature of your neck, literally just from the vibration of the, like, when you're snoring. And this can increase your risk factors for cerebrovascular events in the future, like strokes and other things. So these are all like small signals that you might have an issue with your breathing at night.
It really is something that you need to get dialed in on.
Yeah,
So when you think about that, when you think about like total sleep optimization,
yeah,
what does that look like for you? Like, what do you think that perfect protocol is?
totally. Well, the first thing to note is that sleep is a very sleep optimization is a very individualized
Mm.
thing. That's the first thing to say. Like, you're gonna hear a lot of people kind of going on about this supplement or this specific behavior or whatever. I think there's so much noise in this very large and loud sleep technology and influencer community today that really what you need to do is get out of physiology's way. And what I mean by that is, you know, kind of the modern world that we live in is set up at this point to like destroy our sleep. The phones that you mentioned, the artificial lights, our insane work schedules, the constant availability of food and fluids, social interaction, and all sorts of other things. Right? These are all things that are trying to just get in the way of having a really good night of sleep. So basically, the way that we think about this at Absolute Rest is we kind of have four different buckets of things that we look for. Again, in helping people to like get out of their own physiology's way. So the very first thing that we do is, you know, we look for sleep disorders. There are about 84 sleep disorders that are diagnosable today. And if you have any one of these, it doesn't really matter if you take a magnesium supplement at night. You really just need to address that first, and then you can worry about like the optimization later on. So that's the first thing we do. We kind of look for those sleep disorders. The second thing we do is we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the relationship between the psychology and sleep. So we do a full psychological workup of all of our customers to understand, is there something like excessive stress present, or anxiety, depression, PTSD, a variety of other psychological illnesses that may be plaguing this person. So that's what we look for. And by the way, they don't always have to be a clinical diagnosis. This can just be, again, the acute periods of stress or anxiety that should be approached differently from a sleep perspective. The third thing we do is we look at your environment, right? So at Absolute Rest, we've developed a suite of sensors that effectively just sit on the nightstand of the people that we work with. And this helps us look at every environmental factor that's been implicated in the literature to influence sleep performance. So that's the third kind of category. Things to look out for there, like light, sound, temperature, humidity. A lot of these are pretty well understood. If you just Google sleep hygiene, you can get like general kind of guidelines for that. Things that aren't often talked about are stuff like air quality. Super important, massively impactful for the way that you breathe throughout the night. So, if you're sleeping in a 10 by 10 dorm room, for example, and you have your doors closed, your CO2 levels may be elevated to the point that it's disrupting your sleep and keeping you in a state of wakefulness. So that's something to look out for. Your other things that may be disruptive, if you're living, I'm picking on people who live in dorms at this point, but if you're living in like an old college dorm that was built in the early 1900s, maybe you have particulate matter kind of floating around in the air. So these are, when I say particulate matter, I mean, if you've ever like seen a ray of sun coming through a window and you see like a bunch of little
Mm.
floating things flying around, those are examples of particulates in the air. So these have some pretty deleterious impacts on your respiratory system throughout the night. So that's something else to keep an eye out for. Moving on from environment, basically, another thing that we do very differently is we look at every physiological system of the body that's relevant and optimal sleep, independent of each other. And this is something that's kind of like a vast departure from what a normal kind of clinical sleep study will do. So basically, we have sensors that allow us to look at your brainwave activity, your eye movements, facial muscle activation, your respiratory system, your heart function, major muscle groups in your legs and arms, a variety of other organ systems as well. And we look at all of this, again, as individual nodes that can be optimized later on. So, yeah, I think, I was answering this question about, how, what are some of the things that can be done in this optimal protocol? I think that's kind of how we will approach that question for our clients. The way that I would approach it for like an individual who doesn't work with Absolute Rest is to really become a scientist of your own body. You know, get some method of tracking your sleep. I'd love to talk about wearables and some of the proficiencies and pitfalls that are associated with them. But in general, these wearables are great at helping you to identify things like total sleep time or sleep consistency, meaning when you wake up, when you go to sleep at night, the number of awakenings, as you mentioned earlier. Using a device like that, or using a sleep diary if you don't want to shell out that money, which is basically you're waking up every morning and answering some questions about the night of sleep prior and your current energy levels and things like this. So that's the first step. Develop a system of measurement that you can compare different protocols against. Okay, the next thing to do is there is no shortage online, on podcasts, everywhere of different interesting sleep protocols to go try. So here's what not to do. Don't go and implement 30 different things that you heard about on Huberman all at once, right? Pick a couple, pick like 2 or 3, do that for 2 weeks, monitor your own data through that measurement that we just discussed, and then see the outcome. If this is something that is working really well for you, it's easy to implement, you can do it consistently every night, stick to it and add something else. It's we've I think we've harped on this a little bit just throughout this whole discussion, but like getting really good sleep is a very good idea for every aspect of your life. So it's very worth performing these experiments. We spend so much time thinking about our exercise and our diet and other aspects of our health that sleep is often forgotten about. So this is my kind of, I guess, my appeal to stop forgetting about it. Do some experimentation. So
So I think this would be a great time to kind of just introduce absolute rest and what you
yeah,
guys do, and then we'll build that into the wearables and the whole different world of what you're doing versus what a Whoop would do, for example.
totally. Yeah. And I guess I kind of just, I kind of just like jumped the gun there a little bit to
No, all
describe at
good.
least the assessment. Basically, what we do in a nutshell is we work with elite athletes, executives, high performers in a cognitive and physical sense, and we help them optimize their sleep. So basically, we've redesigned how a sleep assessment should work. I just talked about it a little bit, but basically, we go over 800 different data points for over the course of a 3-night assessment, and then we use that to perform a pretty in-depth analysis where our entire science and clinical team will sit in a conference room and basically, Ryan, what we do is we have a furious debate over what the core insights and optimizations are for our customers. And out of this, we produce a performance plan. So this is similar to how you'd think about a personal trainer building a plan for your fitness. We do the same thing for your sleep that's based on some of the principles I just mentioned of addressing all of the core issues that we observe in data, obviously, but then also performing experiments. So based on your data, here's what we recommend you go and try in the form of new behaviors, new routines, new supplements, new technologies, etc. Um, and then the last thing we do is we really take a lot of time to build specific protocols around how our customers can react to certain stressors that they may have in their life. So, something that we do for our customers, for example, like we have a lot of like athletes that are like just traveling an obscene amount, like 40 weeks out of the year. So how do you wrap your head around how to travel effectively from a sleep perspective? How do you think about international travel? We have a lot of people that have uh, waxing and waning levels of stress as it pertains to their work. So how should your sleep protocols change in reaction to a high stress moment, event, period, versus a low stress one? So like those are some of the questions that we help our customers answer as well. So I hope that was an adequate description and gives you enough to go off of. But
Absolutely. And you mentioned that when you're dealing with those professional athletes, a lot of times they're finishing their games at 10, 11 p.m., and then they have to fly back home and their sleep kind of gets wrecked. So what do you think the best thing to do is when you know that you're going to be out till 1 or 2 a.m.? What's the best thing you could do to kind of minimize the negative effects of that?
yeah, as in the words of my partner at Absolute Rest, Andy Galpin, it depends.
Yeah.
He likes to say that a lot, and it
Oh,
really
yeah.
does. If this is something that if this is something you're doing 5 days out of the week, where you have to go to sleep at 2 and then you're jumping on a plane, that's going to look very different than a UFC athlete that's performing at 11 and isn't needs
Mm.
to perform at their peak at that point, right? Um, so you've got a couple different approaches. If this is a one-time thing, like for example, you're about to spend an all-nighter on a test to studying for a test the next day. Which, by the way, terrible idea. Just in
Awful
general,
idea.
like
The worst.
stop doing that.
Yeah.
You're going to score worse on the test if you pull an all-nighter. Just by
I'm
the way,
glad you said that. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Um, but if for some reason you don't give a shit about what I just said and you decide to do it anyways, a couple things that can be done. Sleep banking, the idea of getting 30 minutes to an hour more of sleep for about 7 days prior to the event is actually a really effective way to mitigate some of the effects of a known sleep depriving event that's coming in
Mhm.
the future. The other thing that we use frequently are strategic naps. That sounds really fancy. It's literally just taking a nap for 25 minutes, once or twice a day, um, like leading up to that stressor. You're doing that like the day of and the day prior. Um, Something else to note is, a lot of people outside of some big, you know, event that you're describing here, a lot of people do this to themselves every week. So, for example, maybe you'll sleep 5 hours a night Monday through Friday because you've got, school and work to contend with. But then on the weekends, you're like, all right, I'm going to catch up on my sleep, and then I'll be fine. It's not how that works. It's actually it's something that we call social jet lag,
Mm,
which I would recommend looking into if this is describing kind of your behavior. But effectively, you're putting yourself on a flight. In that scenario, maybe you have a 2.5, 3 hour discrepancy between sleep on the weekends and sleep on the weekdays. You're basically putting yourself on a flight from New York to San Francisco every weekend, and dealing with the ramifications of that from a physiology standpoint. Um, Without getting into too much detail, it's awful for you. It's like really aggressively bad to do that over a long
mhm.
period of time. Um, so keeping consistency in your schedule is kind of the point that I'm getting at here. Your weekdays should look identical to your weekends. That is, if you're talking about optimal health, that is the best way to do it. Um, so yeah, other reasons why people might be staying up later than they should. If you're going out and having drinks and then jumping immediately into bed, that's also not the best thing to do. We know alcohol is, let's put it this way, if we were in a lab and I was trying to if I was trying to remove one of the most important aspects of sleep, which is REM sleep, which you're familiar with, this is the period of sleep where you're doing a lot of your memory consolidation. It's important for emotional regulation and cognition the next day. If I was to pick a compound that would destroy REM sleep the best, I would actually use alcohol in a lab. Like, that's how bad alcohol is for your sleep. If I wanted to ruin your REM sleep, I would use alcohol. Um, Things that you can do to mitigate this: try and drink earlier in the night. Really go hard in that pregame, but maybe maybe like cut it off at some point before you go to bed. Um, this is going to be really tough for a lot of your listeners, but like a drink an hour in general is the best way to approach that. Um, so that's about the speed that most people can process alcohol, to the point where it's not going to be as detrimental to your sleep. It's still going to have an impact. The reality is, a sip of beer will have an impact on your sleep. Even if it's
Crazy.
taken a couple hours before. So just know that going in. so um, yeah, so I could go on forever with these different scenarios, but those are a couple things that came to mind.
It's so interesting. I had a roommate my sophomore year of college one night, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm just going to have a few glasses of wine tonight to make sure I get a good night's sleep." I was like,
Yeah,
"What?"
that's a really common practice. A lot of people, what alcohol does really well is it reduces something called sleep latency, which is the amount of time between when you want to go to bed and when you fall asleep. But the problem, as I was just mentioning, you know, the quality of your sleep is the thing that suffers the most. So you're going to be able to go to sleep just fine with alcohol in your system, but you're going to wake up feeling hungover and feeling maybe you. Yeah, what is the cause of hangovers? Part of that is literally the sleep deprivation that came from the quality of the sleep that you just got the night before because of the alcohol. So, um, yeah, it's alcohol is a terrible sleep aid. Stop using it.
Yep.
Is the note there? Yeah.
And I think marijuana is as well. That's something that people use for sleep, but it
Yeah.
seems like, based on what I've heard, that it has a pretty similar effect when it comes to REM sleep. Is that true?
Marijuana is pretty interesting. So you're right. It does have a deleterious impact on REM sleep. Not as profound as alcohol. Important to note. But
Definitely.
the weird part with marijuana is a lot of people will use marijuana for that same issue. Like maybe they have anxiety at night and they're trying to use THC to address that. The insidious part about it is it's really effective for a couple weeks, right? You'll use it the first night and it'll be like, oh my gosh, I got 8 hours of sleep and it was amazing and I feel great. And you're gonna do it the next night and the next night and the next night. And right at about the 2 to 3 week mark, there's actually a flip that happens in your
Mm.
physiology. So um, THC actually will enhance deep sleep. It will help you get into deep sleep more efficiently, up until a point. With chronic usage, this is where the problems start to come up, and you'll actually stay in lighter stages of sleep for longer. And so it's really unfortunate because there's so much, a lot of the research that you see coming out about THC's positive impact on sleep is on those shorter time scales. But when you look at the chronic usage, that's when it starts to fall off and the data gets worse. So that's something that's being pretty heavily looked into right now by a bunch of labs around the country. It's not super well understood why that flip happens or where it does. But again, right around that 2 or 3 week mark is when you'll start to feel the
Mhm.
negative impact.
And what do you think about CBD? I was given one time these pack of these sleep gummies, which were just melatonin, valerian root,
Yeah.
and CBD. And I was getting like 96, 97 sleep scores on my Aura Ring whenever I took them. And I didn't keep up with it long because I've heard time and time again about the negative effects of melatonin. But CBD, just in general, what do you think about that?
Yeah, CBD is great for a couple things. First of all, those negative impacts that I mentioned about THC, um, and this is all very preliminary data. There's still a lot of research, frankly, that needs to go into CBD. But it seems as if that switch that happens at the 2 to 3 week mark does not happen with CBD, which is interesting.
Definitely.
CBD, the way that we use it, if we're going to prescribe that for people, is in people that have chronic pain, in people that have chronic anxiety. Um, these are two. If those, so I have a more general comment on supplements like later, but like those are the two use cases that we would bring out CBD
Mhm,
as an experiment, again, where we're constantly monitoring the impact and the efficaciousness of what we're using. But let me talk about supplements in general, because I
mhm.
think a lot of people will go straight to the supplement when they have some sort of sleep issue. Um, and I don't think that's the right approach. So it's really interesting. We've worked with several people that you know heard about melatonin, and they jumped on melatonin and it was really effective for a while, but they're still doing things like watching TikTok in their bed, like we talked about earlier. So you're like, it's the same thing. We were talking about ADD earlier. It's the same. it, I like to equate it to like giving a kid Adderall but then giving them an iPad. It's like putting, you've got this fire of attention issue kind of going on, and you're throwing water on it and lighter fluid at the same time. So that's like a really common thing that we see in sleep as well, is you're throwing supplements at this problem, but then you're doing everything wrong from a behavioral standpoint. And I always want to start with the behavioral stuff. Um, the very basic things that should be happening before you even consider something like a supplement is a, get that sleep test that we talked about done. Look for sleep apnea, insomnia, other things. Not necessarily absolute rest, but like one of the cheaper options that you might see around. Um, the second thing is, you know, make sure you're make sure you don't have a bright light in your room that's on throughout the night, or you have earplugs if you're near a bunch of noise. You can look up sleep hygiene in general and see a bunch of great environmental recommendations there. So get all that stuff out of the way. Work out. It's probably pretty crazy for some people to hear, but there's a really great relationship between physical exercise and the quality of sleep. Um, the I mean, and you kind of don't go down the list here of a few other things as well, but focus on behaviors first before you jump to supplements. Supplements should be thought of as the last 2 to 5% of optimization. They should never be the first line in optimizing someone's sleep.
And when you have those behaviors,
Mhm.
down
Yeah.
and you're starting to think about maybe supplementation, even if you are sleeping well, do you think that would be a good idea? Like taking something like we mentioned before, like magnesium or glycine. Do you think that that's something that people should do if they're sleeping pretty well?
Yeah, if you're in a stage where you're sleeping pretty great and you want to start experimenting, that's the key. Is like don't just take it and not track your data somehow. This again does not have to be with a sleep tracker. It can be subjective metrics pulled from a sleep diary. But you don't want to just take supplements to take them. You really want to measure the impact of these things and see if that's something that you should continue doing. And once you measure a positive impact, you should continue measuring it, like making sure that effect stays around. A lot of people, this happens with melatonin a lot. A lot of people form, they think they'll say something like this, like, I can't sleep without my melatonin gummy or whatever they're taking, right? The reality is that even with really like serious like hypnotic drugs like Ambien, there isn't actually a physiological dependence that's formed, like in the same way that you form a dependence on like cocaine or heroin or something like that. That is almost never the case. It's normally a psychological dependence. So you can't sleep because you got it in your head that you can't sleep without your supplement. And that's a very common thing that we see around melatonin. And it's possible that that could form around something like as benign as magnesium or glycine or other things as well. Your body knows how to sleep better than you know how to sleep. You will always, so this system has been developing for millions of years. And the idea that we need a pill to help us do it is hilarious in the vast majority of cases. So that's just something to note there.
And when it comes to things like magnesium and glycine, why do they work for helping with sleep?
Yeah. So magnesium's just a super important mineral for a variety of different reasons. Some of the things, a way to answer this is to look at what happens in someone that is magnesium deficient, which is actually like a surprising number of the population. I think the last time I saw it was like 30 to 40% of people are magnesium deficient. So some of the things that we see in magnesium deficient people is, I mentioned earlier that at Absolute Rest we measure leg movements throughout the night, periodic leg movements. So I don't know if you guys have ever slept with a partner and they like kick you throughout the night. This is actually you might recommend that they get a sleep assessment done because this is a behavior that's not ideal. Maybe you get them on a magnesium supplement, but in those some of the times when people exhibit a lot of these nighttime leg movements that keep them in the later stages of sleep, it's because of a mineral deficiency like magnesium, like iron. There are a couple other ones as well. A couple other things with magnesium is it's known to have a pretty profound impact on anxiety as
Mm.
well. So if you are deficient in magnesium, your propensity towards anxiety increases. Um, so that's another thing to note. A lot of people take magnesium to address their anxiety and lower their heart rate at night. Um, so that's what I'd say about that.
Well, Josh, this was a blast. Time flew by here,
It
and
did, it did indeed.
I really thank you for being here today.
Totally, it was a lot of fun, Ryan. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Have a great one.
You too.